Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Thursday, the 24th, where we are continuing with the 1960s. As you know, I cheated a little bit, and I have two films to represent the 1960s. We talked a little bit about Psycho last class and the kind of buzz that film generated, so much so that Alfred Hitchcock has been called the father of the contemporary American horror film. If nothing else, Night of the Living Dead had even more buzz associated with it, which also came out in the 1960s, late 1960s. And I've always argued that the 1960s were a particularly tumultuous decade, and that's always been my reasoning for having two films represent that decade. And if you know anything at all about zombies, then you know that they come from Haitian folklore. And the film White Zombie, which came out in 1932, starring none other than Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame, helped to cement the idea of what a zombie was. And that basically was someone who had, through voodoo and also through probably psychological distress, came back from the dead, so to speak. And the idea is that as research was done, actually in the 1980s, from Harvard, I don't know if you know the film Serpent and the Rainbow, which is based on some of the research that was done. The way this worked is that victims would be drugged, probably with poison from the pufferfish, and they would be put in a state that would appear to resemble death, but really wasn't death. And they would be buried, and of course, being having to come up from the grave if they needed to dig their way out, or being unburied by their captors would also provoke enough psychological distress plus the after effects of that poison, so that the individual would basically still be able to do manual tasks, basically serve as unpaid labor, a slave, but would have very little memory of their former life and would not rebel. But the idea of a zombie, that voodoo, a Haitian religion that combines Christianity along with Haitian beliefs. The idea was that there was so much superstition associated with it that there was even a law that was put in the books in Haiti that it was illegal to zombify someone. And the film White Zombie sort of combines the idea of voodoo and hypnotism and medicine all together, or drugs all together, to create a zombie that really is not controversial until a white zombie, a Caucasian zombie, is made. So definitely the film White Zombie is very important in terms of understanding race relations, and also zombies in terms of Haitian folklore are important in terms of understanding what George Romero was able to do, because that was the understanding of zombie until the 1960s, when George Romero, the director, on a shoestring budget, he calls it guerrilla filmmaking, made a film that had a copyright error on it. The copyright symbol was not included in the film, which meant that the film was now a public domain, which was both good and bad for George Romero. Bad because Romero didn't get profits from the film, but good in that the film could be shown any place, anywhere, anytime. So the exposure was phenomenal. And what that exposure meant was that many people saw Night of the Living Dead. And one of the early reviewers of the film called these ghouls, that's what they're known as, ghouls, these reanimated corpses that literally do die and then come back to life. He called them zombies, and the name stuck. So if you were to go to the average person on the street and ask them what a zombie is, they're probably not going to talk about Haitian folklore. They're probably going to talk about the conception from George Romero. Um, so There's a very apocalyptic sense to this film, and there were other films in the 1960s as well that had similar tones. If you know Rosemary's Baby, a wonderful film about the birth of the Antichrist. They actually used a shot from a real publication at the time period that asked, "Is God dead?" So those were the sorts of questions that were being asked in the 1960s. George Romero argues that Night of the Living Dead is a film of revolution. And I think that we can definitely see social commentary embedded within the film. If you know anything at all about the Romero zombie, then you know that the true monsters are not the zombies themselves, but the survivors who are unable to work together as a unit. Think about how future zombie narratives, such as The Walking Dead, owe so much to the Romero zombie. And I would suggest that if you've never seen this film before, that you look for not just the social commentary that exists with it, but some of the reasons why the film might have been so horrifying for audiences at the time. And I can't overestimate how horrifying it was. In fact, in the notes below, I've included a review from Roger Ebert on Night of the Living Dead. In his initial review, he had talked about the film being basically pornographic because it was so visceral. And it was only years later, after the film began appearing on film lists, that Roger Ebert, the very famous film critic, sort of reviewed or re-reviewed his initial responses to Night of the Living Dead and said that he really didn't understand the film and that it really is a masterpiece. So much so that the Library of Congress, remember them? We've talked about them so many times with these films, in 1999 actually included Night of the Living Dead as a film that was culturally, historically, or aesthetically relevant. And there's a lot that I can say about Night of the Living Dead, but I found a wonderful documentary from 2013, and it's a commentary on the filming of Night of the Living Dead. It's called Birth of the Living Dead. And it's rather long. It's an hour and 16 minutes, but I think it's well worth your watching. So I'm going to keep today's video very short so that you can watch the documentary and you can also watch the film itself, which is an hour and 35 minutes. Because there are so many bootleg versions of this film everywhere, I do caution you that if you are going to watch Night of the Living Dead, that you watch a high definition version, which is what I am going to be including for you in terms of your free link. And I guess it's up to personal preference whether or not you want to watch the film first and then watch the documentary afterwards, or vice versa. If you want to watch the documentary first and then the film afterwards. Obviously, there are going to be spoilers in the documentary. But after you've seen both, today's attendance question, which will be due on Saturday. But of course, if you need additional time, let me know. And you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And of course, you would also have a journal due on Saturday as well about Night of the Living Dead. And as you know, the journal should be something that is different from your discussion forum responses. So the discussion forum, it's a response based on a specific question I'm giving you, while your journals are much more open-ended for your thoughts and reflections about the films. So since I'm combining two films for the 1960s, your discussion forum question is, which film, Psycho or Night of the Living Dead, do you think is more horrific, and why? Be curious to read your answer. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I leave you with Night of the Living Dead and the documentary Birth of the Living Dead. And then we can put some closure onto Psycho and Night of the Living Dead before we move to the 1970s. And that gets us to another film that was revolutionary in many ways, entitled The Exorcist. But we'll save that for next week. Take care. Bye-bye.